Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality characteristics that may be at work in the Joel Rifkin case. So Joel Rifkin was a serial killer who was active from 1989 to 1993 in New York. He murdered 17 people. Now, everybody I'll be talking about in this video, of course, are real people. So just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. So first I'll start with the timeline of the crimes, take a look at Joel Rifkin's background, take a look at the arrest and trial, and then the mental health and personality characteristics. So starting with the timeline. This case starts in March of 1989. We see Joel Rifkin, who is 30 years old at that time, drives from his family home in Long Island, New York, to New York City after his mother and sister leave home on vacation. While in New York City, he picks up a prostitute and brings her back to his home. While there, she slept and used heroin, and eventually Rifkin became aggravated with her and struck her in the head with a shell casing from a howitzer. He then strangled her, a very unusual choice of weapon for this first murder. We then see he removes her fingerprints and teeth, and he cuts the victim's body into 6 parts. Eventually, he dumps those parts throughout New Jersey and New York. On March 5, 1989, we see the victim's head is discovered on a golf course in New Jersey. When Rifkin heard the news that the victim was discovered, he became extremely afraid that he would be arrested and go to prison, and he promised to himself that he would never kill again. Now we move to 1991. Rifkin resumes killing. From 91 to 93, we see a series of murders committed by Rifkin. All of the victims were thought to be prostitutes. There's a debate about when some of the murders occurred because many of the victims were found long after they were killed, many of the bodies were dismembered, and 2 of the victims were never found. Now in 1991, there were 5 murders. 2 victims were struck with a table leg. Rifkin also used strangulation. The first victim's remains were never found. The other victims were dumped in the Hudson River, a highway rest stop, the East River, and Coney Island Creek. In 1992, there were 8 murders. Rifkin mostly used strangulation for these murders. The victims' bodies were dumped at the JFK International Airport, in the woods, and in the water. For example, the Hudson River, Newtown Creek, Coney Island Creek, and the Harlem River. In 1993, we see 3 murders. One occurred in February, the next in April, and then the last one in June. The first 2 victims were dumped in the woods, and the third one was found in the back of Rifkin's Mazda pickup truck. This was on the day he was arrested. So now, moving to his arrest, Rifkin's last victim was a 22-year-old woman named Tiffany Bresciani. He had murdered her on June 24, 1993. Now, Rifkin was in his mother's car when he killed her. He put the body in a tarp and wrapped rope around it and put it in the trunk. When he arrived home, his mother demanded the car keys because she wanted to go shopping, so she didn't give him an opportunity to move the body. She took the vehicle and drove around shopping with the dead body in the trunk. Upon his mother's return, Rifkin moved the body to the garage in a wheelbarrow. He put the body in the bed of his Mazda pickup truck right before he went out on June 28. As he was driving to a local airport around 3 a.m., the state police attempted to pull him over because his front license plate was missing. He tried to escape. He led them on a high-speed chase for about 25 minutes and eventually crashed into a utility pole. The police arrested him and found the body in the bed of the truck. When they asked Rifkin for the identity of the victim, he indicated that it was a prostitute who he killed, and he was headed to the airport to get rid of the body. He asked the officers if he needed a lawyer. Right? So I wonder kind of what he thought their answer was going to be here. I mean, he had to know this was a serious offense. Rifkin was interrogated for 8 hours, but the police did not record the sessions. Rifkin claimed that he asked for a lawyer at least 20 times, and the police refused. The police claimed that Rifkin was offered an attorney, but declined. Now, with this situation, who knows what happened, but because he mentioned the word lawyer when he was being arrested, I think that the police should have erred on the side of caution here. Once somebody says lawyer, that should be it, although, of course, police often ignore that. So he could be telling the truth here. He could have asked for an attorney a few times, and they could be lying, or the police could be telling the truth, but it's really hard to know in this situation. It would have been much better if they recorded the sessions. Now, Rifkin confessed to 17 murders and even drew maps for the police. The police stopped by Rifkin's mother's home, where Rifkin lived, and talked to his mother. After this, she called an attorney, who called the state police and told them to stop interrogating Rifkin. They did not discontinue the interrogation. So here we see another kind of risky move by the police. They took a lot of chances here. The whole confession could have been thrown out. It wasn't, but again, they were really playing with fire here. Now moving to the trial. May 9, 1994. After being tried for the murder of Tiffany Reciani, Rifkin was convicted of murder and reckless endangerment. The reckless endangerment charge was because he fled from the police. He received 25 years in prison for the murder and 2 to 7 years for the reckless endangerment. Later, we see he pleads guilty to other murders. Altogether, he would be sentenced to 203 years to life, eligible for parole in 2197. Now taking a look at Rifkin's background. Rifkin was born on January 20, 1959. He was adopted 3 weeks later by Ben and Jeannie Rifkin. His family moved to East Meadow, Long Island when he was 6 years old. Rifkin had a number of problems in school. He was shy and he was bullied by the other students. They called him the turtle because he was hunched over and he had a slow, unsteady gait. He had dyslexia, which had a negative effect on his grades. Now, even though he didn't perform well academically, his intelligence level was thought to be quite high. He received a score of 128 on an IQ test. That's almost 2 standard deviations above the mean. Now, Rifkin was uncoordinated, accident-prone, and not good at athletic endeavors. So this only contributed to more bullying. And this bullying escalated when he was in high school. It included more physical violence, like him being struck with eggs, his head being submerged in a toilet, and the bullies pulling his pants down in front of girls. Now, all this caused his academic performance to decline even more because he started actively avoiding other students. He would deliberately come late to class, and he would be the last to leave school, so he could be left alone. He was just trying to avoid people, and he knew if he came in late and left late, he would not have contact with many students. Rifkin would spend his time alone in his bedroom, and eventually he started fantasizing about sex. Many of these fantasies also included violence. This is a familiar theme when talking about serial killers. One fantasy included women fighting to the death over him, like they were fighting to be with Rifkin. Now, he took an interest in photography. His parents even bought him a new camera, and he joined the high school yearbook committee, hoping to take pictures for the yearbook. But right after he joined, some of his classmates stole that camera. Now, Rifkin decided to stay on the committee, working on non-photography related items. The committee successfully completed the yearbook and held a party afterward to celebrate. They did not invite Rifkin. Evidently, this had a profound impact on him. With Rifkin once again being rejected, he went back to spending time alone in his bedroom. And he took an interest in books about serial killers. He also developed a keen interest in a 1972 movie named Frenzy. This was an Alfred Hitchcock film about a serial killer. He was particularly excited when he saw scenes where female victims were strangled. After graduating high school in 1977, Rifkin attended college. He was unable to make friends there and remained isolated. He would drop out, enroll in another college, and drop out again. Rifkin started dating prostitutes around the time he graduated from high school. He had extreme difficulty talking to women, but he did not seem to struggle too much with this activity. It became like an addiction to him. Now, Rifkin kept doing this to the point where there was a significant financial effect on him. He would use any money he had for prostitutes. This activity also caused him to neglect work and his classes. So this moves us to February 1987. Rifkin was 28 years old. We see that his father, Ben, who was diagnosed with cancer about 6 months before, ended his own life. August 1987, we see Rifkin was arrested for soliciting an undercover officer. Now, he hid this arrest from his mother. This moves us to March 1989, as I mentioned before. This is when Rifkin committed his first murder. Not long after this, he started a landscaping company in 1991 that failed, and he had a series of part-time jobs, but could never really hold on to steady employment. Now moving to the mental health and personality characteristics that might be at work in a case like this. Well, Rifkin killed because he had and entertained powerful fantasies about sex. He had taken 228 items from his victims. He stored these items in his room. Items like jewelry, driver's licenses, medication bottles. Many killers have used items like this to recreate the feeling of the crime, and this is what Rifkin did. Now, we see a number of theories with Rifkin and psychosis. Rifkin said that he would speak to the bodies and that whispers told him to commit the murders. Now, at the trial, we see two different stories in terms of the mental health. The clinician that was hired by the defense said that Rifkin was the most pathological person she had seen in 20 years. She believed that he had paranoid schizophrenia, which was a diagnosis that was available back at the time this trial occurred. Now, the mental health professional hired by the prosecution said that Rifkin was sick, but not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it. So, again, as is fairly common in these types of cases, we get two different stories. One story that points toward like an insanity defense on the side of the defense, and then another story from the prosecution that makes it look like the defendant knew what they were doing the whole time along. So I'll take a look at his personality here and then get into more specifics with mental health, because a lot of the mental health factors are tied in with personality. Now, I use the 5-factor model to conceptualize personality. I remember this through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So it looks like Rifkin is high in openness to experience, including intellectual curiosity. His high IQ seems to be consistent with that. We see low to mid conscientiousness. For example, he was pulled over because he didn't have a front license plate on his vehicle. We see extremely low extroversion, mid-range agreeableness, and mid to low neuroticism. Now, with that personality profile in mind, one theory that comes up, of course, would be psychopathy. Now, psychopathy has two factors, primary and secondary, and each factor has two facets. Factor 1 has interpersonal and affective as the two facets, and factor 2 has lifestyle and antisocial. What's interesting about Rifkin's behavior is how it mainly aligns with characteristics of just one facet from each factor. So with factor 1, on the affective facet, we see a lack of guilt, being callous, having shallow affect, and failing to accept responsibility. These seem to align with Rifkin's behavior. But looking at the interpersonal facet, again of factor 1, we don't really seem to have a good match here. He was not highly manipulative, and he didn't seem to have superficial charm. He was actually really socially awkward. Although one could argue that he did have pathological lying and some grandiosity. Now, moving to factor 2, looking at the lifestyle facet, we see excitement seeking, a parasitic lifestyle, lacking long-term goals, being irresponsible, and being impulsive. All these appear to align with this behavior. But here again, when we look at the other facet, antisocial, he did not seem to have early behavioral problems. He was not a juvenile delinquent, and he didn't have substantial criminal versatility. He pretty much committed the same type of crime over and over. So looking at psychopathy, of course, brings us to looking at antisocial personality disorder, an official mental disorder that aligns with psychopathy. It's not a perfect match, but there is some overlap there. Now we see that Rifkin's behavior does appear to align with the 7 symptoms of antisocial personality disorder: repeated unlawful behaviors, consistent deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggressiveness or irritability, a reckless disregard for safety, irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse. One of the other criteria is having conduct disorder symptoms before the age of 15. His behavior doesn't seem to align with this criterion. It's unusual to have all the symptoms of antisocial personality disorder in the absence of those early conduct disorder symptoms. So we see an unusual situation here where his behavior seems to align with a personality disorder, but the pattern doesn't extend from his childhood. And there's no such thing as a late onset personality disorder. So this is a confusing pattern, quite similar to what we see with Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who also had extremely low extroversion. What about the question of Rifkin being psychotic? This was debated at the trial, as I talked about. He didn't seem particularly paranoid, so paranoid schizophrenia doesn't seem right, but he could have been psychotic without being paranoid. We don't really see strong evidence of hallucinations, but could there have been delusions? Were his fantasies delusional, or were they just unusual? I don't really see strong evidence for delusions either, but there is another explanation for his behavior, in addition to the contribution made from the psychopathy. So this brings me to narcissism. There are some narcissistic characteristics with Rifkin's behavior, a lack of empathy, a sense of entitlement, being self-centered, but overall there's not a lot in the way of narcissism, especially considering how many characteristics of psychopathy seem to align with his behavior. Rifkin seems less narcissistic than most serial killers. Now, Rifkin did have fantasies, and they are narcissistic fantasies, but they're not the kind of fantasies we see in the definition of narcissistic personality disorder, like wanting unlimited wealth and success. They're more like fantasies of him having his way, fantasies of control and domination. So what happened here with this narcissism? Well, Rifkin endured both verbal and physical bullying during all the time he was in elementary school and high school, and I think this had a significant impact on him. He couldn't meet his need to be liked, to fit in, or to find acceptance among his peers in really any way. And due to this, the narcissism forms and becomes protective. The ego finds a way to satisfy those needs. This whole fantasy world is really constructed as that narcissism develops. Now, this alone probably would not have been problematic to the level where somebody becomes a murderer, but we see little here in the way of supervision. Rifkin is able to delve into true crime, and nobody really stops him from kind of obsessing on these different topics. Like again, he's spending a lot of time alone in his room. That was very unhealthy, but with no supervision, that fantasy just grows. He's able to get closer and closer to the fantasy, so he really moves toward that line between fantasy and reality. So he has the fantasies, and he starts thinking seriously about how he could make them come true. His father's death allowed Rifkin to explore his fantasies with really almost no supervision. So at that point, we see a lot of supervisory power and influence is just removed from his life. The fantasy just comes in and seems to really dominate. So with Rifkin, we really see how his avoidance behavior kind of spirals downward and feeds this narcissistic fantasy. People reject him, he avoids them in response, this avoidance grows stronger, and he starts approaching the fantasies, right? So people are going to move in one direction or another. They don't stay stagnant typically. So in the absence of pro-social contacts and a network of friends, he moves toward antisocial thinking. So those are the mental health and personality factors that may be at work in the Rifkin case. I have some other thoughts about this serial killer. We see a while back there was a Seinfeld episode where Elaine was dating a guy named Joel Rifkin. So it was kind of funny the way the episode portrayed it. His name was called out, I think at like a baseball game or something, and it was really embarrassing. And Elaine suggested to him that he might want to consider changing his name. I think everyone who shares a name with a serial killer really does have a tough decision to make, right? It's not fair. Fortunately, this isn't a widespread problem. And some of these serial killers have unusual names, but some don't. Some have fairly common names that I could picture a lot of other people having. So this would be a rare problem that not many people would have. And of course, it's very minor compared to the victims of murder. But it's just something that the Seinfeld episode featured that I thought was interesting. It's interesting they mentioned specifically Joel Rifkin. We also see that Joel Rifkin admired the Green River Killer. Later, he would be identified as Gary Ridgway. I find it curious because these two were actually pretty similar. They both targeted the same population, although Gary Ridgway had higher conscientiousness and higher extroversion. The last part here is we see that Joel Rifkin was caught because of a missing license plate. His arrest really underscores the importance of enforcing all levels of crimes with some degree of vigor. All those detectives, following all the leads they had in this case, were unable to make progress. Joel Rifkin was actually pretty effective at hiding the evidence. But enforcing traffic laws actually paid off, right? So an unexpected benefit of having, again, enforcement across a wide range of criminal activities. Serial killers are typically impulsive and tend to make a lot of mistakes and commit low-level crimes as well. So if they can be arrested for a low-level crime, that could lead to the police discovering the more serious crimes. So all levels of law enforcement are important. Now, I know whenever I talk about topics like serial killers, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.